She didn't scream when they cut the bond. That was the part nobody warned her about. How quiet it would be. How a thing that had lived inside your chest since the moment you first shifted, warm and humming like a coal that never went cold, could simply stop existing between one breath and the next. No ceremony, no final words, just the alpha's hand on the back of her neck and the press of cold iron against her mark. And then nothing. A hollow, where something sacred used to live. Lyra Ashvane was 22 years old, 7 weeks pregnant, standing barefoot in 3 inches of snow, and she was still not screaming. They'd thrown her coat after her. She could remember that detail with a strange, almost clinical precision, even now, 6 years later. The coat had landed in the mud at the tree line. She'd picked it up without looking back. She'd walked north, and she had not stopped. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching this from, because the story you're about to hear is for every person who ever got left behind and decided to survive anyway. If this hits you, share it with someone who needs it, and stay until the end. Trust me on that. Tuos. The snare had been set wrong. Lyra crouched in the frozen mud 12 feet above the valley floor, balanced on a ledge so narrow that her heels hung free over empty air, and studied the problem with the focused patience of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that patience was the only luxury she could afford. The wire was kinked 3 inches from the trigger loop. A rabbit would feel the resistance and pull back before the jaw snapped. She'd lose the catch, lose the hour it had taken to climb up here, and go home to 2 hungry children and a pot of water already boiling with false optimism. She reached in with 2 fingers and worked the kink straight. Her hands were rough in the way that tools became rough. Not damaged, but shaped. The calluses across her palm ran in hard ridges from the bowstring. The scar along her right index finger from the knife slip in her second winter had faded silver white in the cold, and she barely noticed it anymore. She noticed it the way she noticed her heartbeat. It was just something that was there, marking how long she'd been at this. Below her, the valley opened wide and winter pale, the mountain pines dense and black at the edges, their branches heavy with last night's snowfall. This was Grayville Pass. She had named it herself in her first winter because she'd needed something to call the world she was building out of nothing, and naming things had felt like the first act of sovereignty she'd been allowed in years. The wind shifted. Lyra went still. She had not survived 6 winters in the northern range by being slow about the things her wolf told her. Her human mind cataloged: smell of pine resin, cold, the clean bitter edge of altitude. Her wolf said something else entirely. Something underneath all of that carried on the low-pressure system rolling in from the east. She stayed motionless on the ledge for a long 10 seconds and let the second reading come through. Wood smoke. But not hers. Iron. Leather. Horse sweat and metal polish, and the particular musk of pack wolves traveling in formation. That specific density of alpha pheromone that came from large groups moving with coordinated aggression. Her stomach dropped clean through the mountain. She was already moving before her conscious mind finished processing the information. Down the ledge, hands gripping the rock face by memory rather than sight, feet finding holds she hadn't looked at in 3 years but still knew by the particular texture of the stone against her boot soles. She hit the valley floor running. The cabin sat 300 meters off any game trail, tucked against the north face of a rock formation that blocked it from any sight line below the ridge. Lyra had built it herself over her first 2 summers. Bad building at first, drafty and uneven, then progressively better as necessity taught her what timber schools never had. The roof had been rethought 4 times. The south-facing window was positioned to catch exactly the angle of winter light that reached into the valley between noon and 2 o'clock. She knew this place the way she knew her own skeleton. She hit the door running and had it open before the latch had time to protest. 2 faces looked up from the table. "Mom!" The girl, Sarah, had a piece of charcoal in her hand and a smudge of it across her left cheekbone. She had her mother's coloring to our dark hair, olive skin, but her eyes were the silver that stopped strangers cold, the kind of silver that had no business existing in a human face. "You're back early. Get your coats." Lyra was already pulling the emergency pack from behind the door panel. "Both of you." The boy, Ren, didn't ask questions. He was 5 minutes younger than his sister and had inherited, along with his silver eyes, a quality of attention that Lyra sometimes found unnerving: the absolute stillness of a creature that understood danger before it announced itself. He was already standing, pushing his chair back without sound, reaching for his coat from the hook. Sarah was 3 heartbeats slower. "What did you smell?" "Wolves, a lot of them, moving this way." "Pack wolves?" "Yes." Sarah's charcoal dropped to the table. She was up. Lyra was mentally calculating as she moved. The emergency route went up the north face into a series of caves she'd mapped in her second year. Enough stored supplies for 4 days. The children knew the path. She'd walked them through it twice a year since they were old enough to move fast. The question was time. If the army was already in the valley mouth, she had maybe 40 minutes before Point Scouts reached this elevation. If they'd come from the eastern pass, she had less. "How many?" Wren asked. He was pulling on his second boot with sharp, efficient movements. "Enough that I could smell them from the Greyvile ledge." That made him pause just for a second. He knew what that ledge was. He knew what the distance meant. "That's a battalion." His voice was too flat for a child his age, but Lyra had long since stopped flinching at the way her children talked. When your entire education came from a woman who had survived exile and built a life out of nothing, you developed a certain unsentimental relationship with reality. Or bigger. Could be. She handed Sarah the lighter pack. Medical supplies, fire kit, the rolled skin of written notes she'd spent 4 years compiling because information was the only wealth that didn't rot. "Wren gets the food sack. I carry weapons and tools. We move in 3 minutes." "Mom?" Sarah caught her wrist. Lyra stopped, looked at her daughter. The silver eyes were calm, but doing that thing they sometimes did. That deep, focused thing, like something was running behind them that had nothing to do with a 6-year-old child's inner life. "They're going to find the cabin," Sarah said, "whether we're in it or not." "I know. So we're just leaving everything. We're leaving things. We're keeping us." Lyra pulled her wrist free, not unkindly. 3 minutes. They made it to the first cave with 22 minutes to spare. Lyra knew because she'd counted her own steps, and she knew exactly how long it took her to move at that pace across that terrain. She also knew it meant she'd had more time than she'd feared, which meant the army had entered from further east than she'd initially calculated. That was either luck, or they were being deliberately careful about their approach. Careful was worse than fast, usually. She settled the children against the back wall of the cave and went forward to the opening, staying low, eyes tracking the tree line below. "Can I look?" Wren asked from behind her. "Stay back." "I can see further than you." That was true, technically. Both children had inherited something from their father's bloodline that Lyra had never been able to fully account for, a clarity of sight that went beyond standard wolf enhancement. She had theories about what it meant. She did not examine those theories too closely, because the conclusions they led to were ones she'd spent 6 years trying to outrun. "I know you can," she said. "Stay back anyway." A silence. Then, with the particular form of compliance that had always been uniquely Wren's, complete obedience and complete disagreement existing simultaneously, "Yes, Mom." She watched the tree line. For 20 minutes, nothing. Then they came out of the pines, untouched. She had expected soldiers. What she got was something larger. The advanced scouts were 4 wolves in human form, moving in diamond formation, wearing black and iron gray gear that marked them as Iron Veil military, the Alpha King's own forces. Behind them, spreading out through the valley in a movement so practiced it looked almost slow, came more. Many more. Mounted soldiers, foot infantry, a supply train that meant this wasn't a scouting run. This was occupation, or passage, or something she couldn't categorize yet. And then the riders, 3 of them in the center of the formation, positioned in a way that required no insignia to explain. The horses were heavier and better fed than anything else in the column. The 2 flanking riders maintained exactly 2 horse lengths of distance from the central figure, automatic as breathing, without any visible communication. Lyra couldn't see the central rider's face clearly from this distance. She could feel him. That was what made her breath stop. There was no logical framework for it. She had not felt another wolf's presence at range. Truly felt it, in the bone-deep, resonant way, since they'd pressed iron against her mark and cut the bond 6 years ago. She'd made her peace with existing in a muffled world, with experiencing her wolf sense as something always slightly dampened, always reaching for a signal that wasn't there. Whatever rolled up the mountain from that central rider was not muffled. It wasn't a signal she was reaching for. It hit her the way cold water hits skin. Immediate, total, impossible to process as anything other than what it was. Her wolf surged forward inside her chest with a force that nearly knocked her sideways. She pressed her back against the cave wall. "Mom?" Sarah's voice, very careful. Lyra took 2 slow breaths, let the shake move through her shoulders and out. Locked it down. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." Ren, flat and factual. "Your hands are doing the thing." She looked at her hands. They were steady. She made them stay that way by pure force of will. "We wait," she said. "We don't move. We don't make sound. And we wait." They waited 4 hours. Lyra watched the army make camp in the valley below with the systematic efficiency of an organization that had done this so many times it no longer required thought. Fires appeared, tents in organized rows, a perimeter established with a precision that told her these were not conscripts. These were professional soldiers, trained and drilled, operating under command structures that had been stress-tested in real conditions. Iron Veil. The kingdom that had for 30 years been slowly absorbing the fractured northern territories under a single authority. She'd been aware of Kael Dryke's expansion campaigns in the abstract way she was aware of most things beyond her valley, as information gathered from the occasional traveler passing through the lower passes, from the patterns of refugee movement she sometimes tracked at distance, from the way the political weather of the wider world occasionally sent ripples even into Greyville. She had never expected to be in the path of it. The smell that had hit her on the ledge was still there, still running underneath everything else, like a current beneath river ice. She had categorized it, examined it from every clinical angle available to her, and arrived at the same conclusion every time. She refused to let herself finish that conclusion. When the sky had shifted to deep indigo and the camp below was fully established, she turned back to the children. "We sleep in shifts," she said. "I take first watch, 4 hours each." "Mom." Sarah had been quiet for the last 2 hours, which with Sarah meant she'd been thinking hard. Her silver eyes caught what little light the cave offered. "Who's the rider in the middle?" Lyra looked at her daughter. Sarah met her look without flinching. "The one you couldn't stop watching." Children, Lyra had learned, noticed everything. This was not always convenient. "Someone important," Lyra said. "Important like danger, or important like we are staying in this cave until they move through the valley and continue east. Which armies do? They move. They don't stop." She said it with conviction because it needed to be true. "Get some sleep." Sarah didn't push. Ren was already arranged against the wall with his eyes closed, though Lyra was reasonably certain he wasn't sleeping. She turned back to the cave mouth. The central rider's fire was the largest in the camp, obviously. She told herself she was tracking it tactically. The position of command tents, the spacing of perimeter guards, the number of horses, and what that indicated about force size. All of that was true. She also told herself she wasn't thinking about the way that presence had rolled up the mountain and found something inside her that she had been very sure no longer existed. That was less true. Check. The morning brought snow, light first, then heavier. The kind of mountain snowfall that could be beautiful for about 20 minutes before it became a serious tactical problem. Lyra had the children eat cold from the stored pack, dried meat, hard bread, a small skin of water, and watched the camp below shake off the night. No eastward movement. They were setting up more permanently. A second line of tents going in. The supply train being reorganized. Her jaw tightened. "They're staying," Ren said from behind her shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. She was going to have to speak to him again about announcing himself, except that the part of her that was a mother of wolves, rather than a disciplinarian, found it quietly impressive, the way he moved. "Looks like it." "How long?" "I don't know." She watched a group of soldiers working to clear a flat area near the largest tent, a command space being expanded. "Days, maybe." "We can't stay in this cave for days. We have supplies for 4. "I didn't say we couldn't survive it," Ren said. He had a quality in his voice sometimes that she'd learned meant he was about to say something very direct. "I said we can't stay here for days. Sarah's going to go sideways by tomorrow morning without something to do. And A pause. "I want to know who they are." Lyra turned from the cave mouth and looked at her son. He was 6 years old and had his father's... No. He was 6 years old and he was hers, and that was the only lineage that mattered in the world she'd built here. The silver eyes were steady. His coat was too short at the wrists, the way his coats were always getting, because he was growing so fast. "We're not going down there," she said. "I know. We're not making contact." "I know, Mom." "Then what exactly are you proposing?" Ren considered this with the gravity of someone twice his age. "That we find out who they are before they find us. Because they're going to find us. You know they're going to find us. The cabin is down there, and it's obviously lived in, and those scouts are good." He glanced down at the camp with an expression that was precise and measuring. "If we know who they are first, we're not completely at a disadvantage when it happens." Lyra looked at her son for a long moment. He was not wrong. The scouts had found her cabin. She'd seen 2 of them approach it in the early morning, examine the door, look at the woodpile. Whatever report they'd brought back to the command tent had caused movement she couldn't interpret from distance. Someone in that camp now knew that someone lived here. The question of who they were was no longer merely academic. "We observe," she said, "from the ridge, carefully." Ren's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes settled. "Wake Sarah," Lyra said, already moving for her pack. The ridge above the eastern edge of the valley offered a sightline that had served her well over the years. Good angle, excellent natural cover in the form of a rock formation that looked like a fallen wall, enough distance to maintain safety while still seeing faces in good light. She'd used it to watch travelers, weather patterns, the occasional pack wolf who wandered too close to her territory without knowing what they were entering. She'd never used it to watch an army. They were in position by the time the mid-morning light had cut the valley at a usable angle, and Lyra had her first clear look at the camp layout from above. It was bigger than she'd estimated. 300 minimum, possibly 400 if the tents were more densely occupied than standard. "There," Sarah said quietly, a breath beside her left ear. Lyra followed her daughter's eye line. The man who emerged from the command tent was not what she'd built in her head over the past hours, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd been building. He was tall, that read even at distance, the particular height that changed how space organized itself around a person. Dark-haired, moving without any of the self-conscious deliberateness that men who wanted to project power often fell into. His authority was apparently so thoroughly integrated that he'd stopped performing it. He stood at the edge of the tent's cleared space and said something to the soldier beside him. Lyra was too far to hear words, close enough to read the soldier's response, an immediate nod, a pivot, an efficient departure to carry the order out. Then the man turned and looked up at the ridge. Not at her, not precisely, but in the direction of the ridge, and at a height that suggested he was tracking something with a good instinct for where an observer might position. Lyra went absolutely still. Beside her, she felt both children do the same. That synchronized response to her cues that they'd developed over years of practicing exactly this kind of watching. The man held the look for a long 5 seconds, then turned back to his camp. "He knows someone's up here," Ren said. "Maybe." "He does. Look at how he positioned the perimeter guards after." Ren's voice was very quiet. 2 moved, both facing the ridge. He did that without giving visible orders. Lyra made herself look away from the man's broad back and found the perimeter guards, found the 2 who had shifted. Her son was right. The smell was worse up here. Closer to the camp, the wind running in the right direction. She had her wolf locked down with everything she had, and it was still pressing up against her ribs in a way that she was choosing not to examine. "We need to go back to the cave," she said. "Mom?" "Now." The scouts found the cave before noon. She heard them coming from 30 seconds out. 2 of them, moving with the controlled quiet of trained trackers, and the fact that she heard them at 30 seconds rather than 60 told her they were very good. She had the children behind her and herself positioned at the cave mouth with the hunting knife out before the first face appeared at the entrance. The scout, young, male, iron veil gray, took one look at the knife and stopped moving. His partner materialized behind his left shoulder and also stopped. "Occupied," the first one said carefully. "Obviously," Lyra said. A pause. The scouts exchanged a glance that communicated something in the shorthand of people who've worked together a long time. "We mean no harm," the first scout said. "We're asking that anyone found in the valley present themselves to command. It's a standard territorial. I know what it is. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, stripped down to its working edge. This isn't your territory. It is as of 6 days ago, by agreement with the Northern Council. The Northern Council? She nearly laughed, because the Northern Council was 3 old alphas in a wooden hall 2 days' travel south, who had spent the better part of a decade selling their population's autonomy in small increments to whichever expanding power scared them most. She hadn't bent knee to them in 6 years. She wasn't going to start now. No agreement that I made, she said. The scout tried a different approach. His face went careful and neutral in the way of someone shifting tactics. Ma'am, we have children in this area. If you have children, you're looking at them. Both scouts glanced past her. Both registered the silver eyes and went very still. That stillness. Lyra had seen it before. Not often, because she kept the children away from any possible contact, but the few times a traveler had caught a glimpse, there had been that same brief pause, that biological recognition of something significant. I'm asking you to come with us, the first scout said. His voice had changed. More careful now, and not in the tactical way, in the recognition way. Willingly. It would be better than... Better than what? A silence. Better than the alternative, he finished. Lyra looked at the 2 scouts, then at her children, then at the knife in her hand, then at the math of the situation, which was not complicated. 300 soldiers in the valley below. 2 scouts at her door who had clearly already communicated their position to command. The alternative was not an option she could execute with a hunting knife, and 2 6-year-olds behind her. She was very good at what she was. She'd had to become very good at what she was, but she was also very honest with herself about what she was not. She lowered the knife, did not sheath it. We walk in on our own feet, she said. Of course. My children stay next to me. Agreed. And you keep your hands visible the entire way down. The scout's eyebrows moved slightly. Yes, ma'am. Chamat. The walk down took less than 20 minutes. Longer than it should have, maybe, because Lyra moved at a pace set by her own assessment of the terrain and not by the scout's visible desire to move faster. She kept Sarah on her left and Ren on her right, close enough that she could feel the warmth of them without making contact. The camp organized itself around their arrival in that particular way that armies did. Information traveling faster than feet, the subtle shift of attention across a large group that meant the order had come down to observe but not approach, and the way that order was visible in the very precise way that nobody was looking at them. The command tent was larger up close. The cleared space around it had been expanded since this morning, and the man she'd watched from the ridge was standing at its entrance with 2 senior soldiers flanking him at a distance. Lyra had spent the walk down convincing herself that the smell was coincidence, was stress, was 6 years of isolation playing tricks on a wolf. Sense she'd never fully trusted since the bond cutting. She'd almost believed it. Then she was 20 feet away, and the man turned to look at her, and every careful construction she'd built in the last 15 hours came apart without ceremony. Up close, he was what he'd been at distance, built for permanence, the face of a man who had made a lot of decisions under pressure and had stopped being surprised by the cost of them. Dark eyes that ran a fast, thorough assessment the moment they landed on her. The kind of intelligence that didn't advertise itself. And the smell. God. Up close, the smell. Her wolf was not pressing against her ribs anymore. Her wolf had gone entirely silent and entirely alert in the way that her wolf only ever went when something fundamental was happening. Alpha King, the first scout reported behind her, found in a cave on the northeast ridge, armed, 2 children. She came willingly. The man's eyes moved from her face to the children, and stopped. Lyra watched his face. She watched the precise moment that he saw the silver eyes. His expression didn't change. His body didn't change. He was very controlled, this man, very practiced at keeping the interior from becoming exterior. But she was standing close enough now, and she'd spent 6 years sharpening every sense she had, and she saw it anyway. The single arrested moment of recognition so total and so devastating that it briefly shut down everything else. "Leave us," he said. The scouts departed. The flanking soldiers stepped back far enough to create the fiction of privacy. The man looked at her children for another long moment. Then he looked at her. "How long?" he said. His voice was quiet, not soft, the kind of voice that had given hard orders for a long time. 6 years. His jaw moved slightly. And you've been in these mountains since the beginning. Another silence. The wind came off the north face, and she watched him process the math the same way she'd processed it on a different winter day long ago, standing at the tree line with a coat in the mud, and nowhere to go but forward. Who sent you north? He asked. The Ashvane Pack Council. On whose authority? Her eyes didn't drop. Yours. The silence that followed that was the kind that changed the shape of the air. I gave no such order, he said, and his voice had dropped into something that wasn't quiet anymore. It was the flat register of a man approaching something that was going to require his worst self and his best self simultaneously. I know. Lyra held his gaze. That's what took me 6 years to stop being afraid to say. Kyle Drykey, Alpha King of Iron Vale, looked at the woman standing in front of him with the hunting knife still loose in her hand and 2 silver-eyed children at her sides. And for the first time in a long time, she watched a powerful man look like the ground had gone out from under him. Then he looked at the children again, then back at her. They're mine, he said. Not a question. Something worse than a question. They're mine, Lyra said immediately, and her voice was the same thing his had been, final, carved into stone. They've been mine for 6 years, and nothing that happens next changes that. His eyes didn't leave her face. I'm not going to argue that, he said slowly, but I need you to understand what you've just walked into. I understand exactly what I've walked into. You walked into the camp of a king who just found out that his... He stopped, started again, controlled. You need to understand that I'm not going to let you walk back out. Her hand tightened on the knife. Not as a prisoner, he said, and his voice had shifted into something that was almost careful with her, and that was more alarming than the command tone. But we have a great deal to discuss, and I have 6 years of questions, and whatever you think of what you're looking at right now, I think you're the man whose name was on the order that put me in those mountains, Lyra said. I think you have excellent soldiers and a very large army, and I have 2 children and a hunting knife. I think I am not in a position to refuse you. And I think... She looked at him, really looked, let herself do it for the first time since they'd reached the tent. I think you need to understand that I haven't survived 6 years up here by trusting men with power. Any of them, including... She stopped herself a half second before the word, including men who are standing very close and smelling like something I spent 6 years trying to forget. The silence that followed that was different from all the previous silences. You feel it, Kyle said. I feel it, Lyra confirmed. And I'm telling you right now that what I feel and what I trust are 2 completely separate things. And I am not here because I chose to be here, and my children are not here because they chose to be here. Her voice didn't shake. She'd stopped letting her voice shake a very long time ago. So whatever conversation comes next, it starts from that. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, 2 of my senior pack council members authorized an exile order that should never have existed, and they used my seal to do it. His eyes were absolutely steady. I want you to know that I know that, and I want you to know that whatever it costs to answer for it, I will pay it. Lyra looked at him. I'm not interested in what you'll pay, she said. I'm interested in what comes next for my children. She nodded at the twins, who had been standing silent and watchful through the entire exchange in a way that was probably doing something to Kyle's inner life, but that she was not going to be distracted by. That's the only conversation I'm having. His gaze moved to the children, held there. When he looked back, something had shifted in his face, not breaking open exactly, but something like the moment ice decides it's spring. Then let's start there, he said. Behind them, at the edge of the cleared space, one of the flanking soldiers had gone very still. Lyra felt the shift in attention a half second before she understood why. New arrivals, fast-moving, the controlled urgency of someone bringing information the command structure wasn't expecting. The soldier reached Kyle's side and bent close. 3 words. She caught only the last one. Ashvane Council, now. The temperature in Kyle's expression dropped about 15 degrees. He turned back to Lyra, and what she saw in his face in that moment was something that her 6 years of exile had trained her to read very accurately. a man who had just received information that was about to change the shape of everything, and who was deciding very fast how much of that change to let her see. "Stay here," he said. "I'm not—" "Please." The word came out rough at the edges, like it had cost him something. "Just for a moment." He turned and walked toward the tent entrance, the soldier behind him, and Lyra stood in the cleared space with her children and her knife, and the dawning, terrible understanding that whatever had just come in with those 3 words was not only about her exile, it was about why she'd been found. And it was why they had come into these mountains, not on a routine expansion campaign at all. Sarah's hand found hers, warm and small and silver-eyed. Lyra gripped it without looking down. Whatever the next hour brought, she was done running. But as the tent flap closed behind the Alpha King and his soldier, and as the camp around her shifted in that subtle way of a large organization, responding to a command ripple she couldn't yet see the source of, as all of that settled into place around her like a net she'd walked into with her eyes open, she heard a single word come through the tent canvas, carried on the voice of the arriving soldier. A name. Her former Alpha's name. And with it, the confirmation of something she had spent 6 years trying not to know. They hadn't exiled her because she was weak. They had exiled her because they had known exactly what she was. The name she'd heard through the canvas was Aldrich Voss. She knew that name the way she knew scar tissue, not by choice, but by the permanent marking of something that had happened to her body without her consent. Aldrich Voss had been the Ashvane Pack's senior council head. He had been the one who'd held her shoulders while the iron pressed against her mark. He had been the one who'd said, in a voice of complete bureaucratic calm, that the council had determined she represented a liability to Pack security, and that the northern exile was both lawful and necessary, and that she should be grateful the sentence wasn't permanent. She had been 7 weeks pregnant and standing in the snow. She had not said anything back to him. She had picked up the coat. She had walked north. She thought about that now, standing in the cleared space outside the command tent with her daughter's hand in hers, and the camp organized around them in the careful non-attention of soldiers who had been ordered to observe but not engage. She thought about what it had cost her to stay quiet in that moment. What she'd told herself it was pitzolk, survival intelligence, not fear. The understanding that there was nothing she could say that would change the next 10 minutes, and that energy spent on words that wouldn't land was energy she needed for the walking. 6 years later, she was still doing the math on that decision, still not sure whether she'd been wise or whether she'd simply been too stunned to speak. The tent flap opened. Kyle came out alone. Whatever had been in his face when he'd gone in, that 15-degree drop, that controlled fury, had been replaced by something more dangerous. The deliberate blankness of a man who had decided the next thing he did needed to come from somewhere below feeling. "Aldrich Voss is 3 days south," he said. "He sent a rider ahead. He's requesting an audience." Lyra looked at him. "He knows I'm here," she said. Not a question. The scout report went down the line before I could contain it. His jaw was tight. "I'm sorry. That was a failure on my end." She almost laughed. Not with humor. With the specific exhaustion of watching a powerful man apologize for a tactical error and call it the same thing as culpability. "What does he want?" The writer's message said he wants to discuss Northern territorial agreements. Kyle's eyes were on her face, reading it. "What it actually means is that he wants to know what you've told me." "I haven't told you anything yet." "He doesn't know that." A silence stretched between them. In it, she heard the camp. Fires crackling, horses moving, the low registers of soldiers conducting the ordinary business of an army, making itself comfortable somewhere it intended to stay. She heard Wren shift his weight behind her, the small sound of his boot on packed snow. "What happens when he arrives?" she asked. "That depends on what you tell me before he does." She looked at Kyle for a long moment, looked at the face of a man who had, by his own account, not issued the order that exiled her, and who had, by the fact of his seal on that order, made it possible anyway. The distinction was real. She wasn't willing to pretend it wasn't. The distinction was also, from a certain angle, not as significant as the man seemed to need it to be. "You want my account," she said, "so you have it before he can construct his." "Yes, and in exchange, I give you my word that Aldrich Voss does not come within speaking distance of you or your children without your explicit consent." She almost said something sharp about the value of the word of a king, whose seal had been used to exile a pregnant woman. She stopped herself, not out of diplomacy, but out of accuracy. There was a difference between a man whose authority had been corrupted by people around him and a man who had done the corrupting. She was not yet certain which one she was looking at. That uncertainty was the only thing keeping this conversation civil. "Inside," she said, "bought." The command tent was larger than it looked from outside, divided by a canvas partition she hadn't anticipated. Maps on the left. The northern territories marked with routes and supply lines in a hand that was either Kael's or someone who thought the way he did. A long table, 2 chairs, no performance of comfort. This was a working space. She sat without being invited to. He sat across from her without commenting on it. Sarah and Ren positioned themselves at her sides with their backs against the tent wall, and Lyra felt Kyle clock this out, the way the children had organized themselves, not as children seeking comfort, but as a unit supporting a point position, and felt him file it away. "Start wherever you need to start," he said. "I'll start with the part you don't already know." She laced her fingers on the table, kept them still. "I was brought before the council 6 years ago, the morning after my shift. You know what a first shift looks like. You know what the physical profile looks like when someone presents as an alpha bloodline." She paused and let that land. "I presented as an alpha bloodline." His face did not change. His eyes did. "The Ashvane Council had a specific arrangement," she continued. Omegas who presented off-profile, who showed alpha traits or healing abilities or bloodline markers that didn't match their registered pack origin, were classified as liabilities. The word they used was contamination risk. What they meant was that those wolves created questions about pack lineage that the council found inconvenient. "Inconvenient," he said quietly. Their power structure ran on lineage records. Who was alpha-born? Who was omega-born? Who could claim status within the pack hierarchy? A wolf who crossed those categories was a problem because they implied the records were incomplete. She met his eyes. Or fabricated. Kyle was very still. "I had also, 6 months prior to my exile, submitted a formal grievance to the council about the treatment of 3 Omega females in the pack's eastern settlement. Standard grievance process. I documented what I'd witnessed. I filed it correctly." She let a beat go by. "The council acknowledged receipt and took no action. 2 months later, I was told I'd been identified as a contamination risk. They exiled you for filing a grievance," he said. "They exiled me for the bloodline presentation. The grievance was why they moved quickly." She unfolded her hands. "I'm telling you the order of events because you're going to want to know whether this was targeted or whether I was one of several. I believe I was one of several. I have no proof of that beyond the patterns I was able to observe in the 2 years before my exile, which isn't admissible in any council proceeding, but it's what I know." Kyle leaned back in his chair. Not relaxed. The opposite of relaxed, in the way of a man who needed distance between himself and what he was hearing in order to process it without doing something irreversible. "Aldrich Voss ran the classification system," he said. It wasn't a question. "Aldrich Voss and 2 council members whose names I can give you. One of them is still active in the Ashvane hierarchy. The other retired to the southern coast, I was told, though I have no way to verify what I was told before my exile." "You were told before or after the—" "Before. 2 days before. A woman I trusted warned me that my name had come up in council closed session. I wasn't given enough time to do anything about it, but I had enough time to understand what I was walking into." Her voice stayed flat. "I walked into it anyway because I didn't believe they'd actually do it. I had committed no violation. I had done nothing outside the law. I walked in believing the law would hold. The silence after that had weight." "How long did it take you to stop believing that?" Kyle asked. Quietly. The way you asked something when you already knew it was going to cost the other person something to answer. "About as long as it took me to walk to the tree line." She looked at him. "Not very long." He stood up. He didn't go far. 3 steps toward the map side of the tent and back. The movement of a man burning off something that had nowhere to go in a controlled space. She watched him without turning her head, tracking it in her peripheral vision, reading the coil of it. He was angry in the specific way that powerful men got angry when they discovered their power had been borrowed without their knowledge. Not at themselves, not initially, but at the particular shape of betrayal that implied they'd been made fools of. She understood that anger. She had no use for it right now, but she understood it. Your seal was on the order, she said. He stopped. I know, he said. I need you to tell me how. He turned. His face had something in it that she hadn't seen on it yet. Not the controlled authority, not the shock of recognition, but something that cost him more than both. Council protocol in the Ashvane territory allowed senior members to execute administrative orders under the King's administrative seal for matters classified as internal pack discipline. It was a delegation of bureaucratic authority, not governing authority. It was never meant to... He stopped, started again. It was a mechanism for processing routine pack management decisions without requiring my direct attention. Voss used it for an exile order, which was outside its authorized scope, and did so during a period when I was engaged in the Eastern Border Campaign and my administrative oversight was limited. Lyra looked at him. So they found the hole, she said. Yes. And they used it while you were busy. Yes. And the woman who filed a grievance and presented with the wrong bloodline profile ended up in the mountains while that hole stayed open. Yes. His voice was down in its lowest register. Yes. That is what happened. She nodded once. Not forgiveness. She wasn't there and didn't know if she would be. But acknowledgement. The accounting of a thing stated clearly and received clearly, which was more than she'd gotten 6 years ago. Then here's what I need from you, she said, before Aldrich Voss arrives. Before any of this becomes a council proceeding or a territorial matter or whatever language you're going to use for it. I need your word, not your administrative seal, not a delegation of authority. Your word directly to me that my children's status in this camp is not contingent on my cooperation with whatever comes next. Kyle looked at her for a long moment. They're mine, she said. And there was nothing in her voice when she said it except the 6 years of mountain winters compressed into 4 syllables. Say yes or say no. Yes, he said. Their safety is not contingent on anything you do or don't do. That's absolute. Sarah made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Lyra didn't look at her, kept her eyes on Kyle. Then I'll give you everything I can remember, she said. Names, dates, what I observed before the exile. It won't be admissible without corroboration. I'll find the corroboration. You might not like what else you find when you start looking. Something crossed his face. I'm aware of that. Are you? Lyra. Her name, the first time he'd used it, landed in a way she wasn't prepared for and refused to show. I've been running this expansion campaign for 4 years. Do you know how many packs we've absorbed in that time? How many pack councils we've reviewed for integration? His eyes were steady. I have files, I have documents, I have a growing number of cases that look like what you're describing, coming from 3 different pack territories, and I have been trying for 2 years to find the thread that connects them. You're not just a grievance. You might be the whole architecture. The quiet inside the tent shifted. She looked at her children without meaning to. Ren was watching Kyle with that measuring expression. Sarah had her hands folded in her lap in a posture that was too still for a 6-year-old, too controlled. She looked back at Kyle. You came into these mountains for this, she said. You weren't just passing through. No. Someone told you. Someone gave me a lead, a name connected to the Ashvane Council exile records. I've been tracing it for 3 months. He paused. Your name was in the file, listed as deceased. The word landed with a specific quality, like cold water finding a crack in stone. Deceased, she repeated. Exposure death, Northern Range, recorded 8 weeks after your exile. His eyes didn't leave her face. Aldrich Voss signed the death record. Lyra sat with that for a moment. She sat with the particular experience of discovering that you had been officially erased from existence, that somewhere in a council record your life had been tidied away with a signature and a cause of death, that for 6 years the world that had known you had understood you to be gone. She sat with it the way she'd sat with the bond cutting, the way she'd sat with the snow and the coat and the mud. By going very quiet inside and letting the size of it be what it was without trying to make it smaller. He's coming here to find out what survived, she said. Yes. Because if I'm alive and talking to you, then the death record is fraud, and the fraud connects back to everything else he covered. Yes. She stood up. Kyle didn't move, but his attention sharpened in a way that was entirely physical, the alertness of a man recalibrating whether the woman across from him was about to do something he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't. She was just done sitting. 3 days, she said, approximately. Then we have 3 days to build something he can't dismantle when he arrives. She looked at Kael across the table, the width of it between them, the maps, the winter light coming through canvas, the two silver-eyed children against the wall. I'm not running anymore. I want to be clear about that. I spent 6 years running, and I'm finished with it. But I'm also not going to stand in front of Aldrich Voss with nothing but my word and your word and let him call us both liars. Her chin came up. Whatever we build in 3 days better hold. Kael looked at her. In his face was something she hadn't seen on it yet. Not the authority, not the fury, not even the recognition of the mate bond that had been sitting between them since the cleared space outside the tent, like a third person in every conversation. Something underneath all of that. Something that looked, with a frankness she hadn't expected from him, like relief. Like a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just been told he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. It'll hold, he said. She almost said something about the reliability of that kind of certainty from a man who'd once let his seal be borrowed by someone who used it to bury a pregnant woman in the mountains. She didn't, because she was honest enough with herself to recognize the difference between caution and cruelty. And because she had made a decision on the walk down from that cave, a quiet ground-level decision that she hadn't announced to anyone, including herself, until just now, when it became visible in the fact that she was still standing in this tent. She had decided to stay. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the alternative was spending another 6 years looking over her shoulder at the shadow of Aldrich Voss, and she was done with that too. Done with the cost of it, the weight of it, the way it had pressed against everything she'd tried to build in the mountain silence. She was done surviving. She wanted to live somewhere. She wanted her children to live somewhere, even if that somewhere was complicated by a king who smelled like the thing she'd trained herself not to want. She turned to Sarah and Ren. You hungry? Yes, Sarah said immediately. Starving, Ren confirmed with the gravity of someone reporting a tactical situation. Lyra looked back at Kael. Feed my children. Then we get to work. He nodded. And for just a moment, before he turned to call his soldier, she saw something move through his face. Something fast and entirely uncontrolled, there and gone in under a second. The look of a man who had just understood that the woman standing across from him was not someone he was going to protect. She was someone he was going to have to keep up with. Outside, somewhere on the southern route, Aldrich Voss was riding north with 3 days of road between him and the thing he'd buried. He didn't know yet that what he'd buried had learned to build. The 3 days didn't hold. Aldrich Voss arrived in 36 hours. Lyra heard the horn signal from the southern pass at mid-morning of the second day and understood immediately what the shortened timeline meant. He hadn't been 3 days south when his rider reached the camp. He'd already been moving. He'd been moving before he sent the rider ahead, which meant the rider wasn't a courtesy announcement. It was a measurement tool, sent to see how the camp responded, how quickly word came back, whether the Alpha King's reaction suggested he already knew what Voss was carrying. She was standing at the edge of the cleared space outside the command tent when the column appeared through the tree line. Smaller than she'd expected. 12 riders, tight formation, the kind of escort that projected confidence rather than caution. Aldrich Voss rode third from the front, which was its own statement, not leading, letting the two outriders absorb the first read of the terrain, but close enough to the point that retreat wasn't the posture. He looked older. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with a clarity that surprised her, because she'd spent 6 years keeping his face in a particular fixed quality in her memory. The bureaucratic calm of it, the unhurried authority. And the man who rode into the valley had some of that still, but had also been worn by something. Not guilt. Men like Voss didn't wear guilt the way other men did. Something more like the specific aging of a person who has been maintaining a careful structure for a long time and has recently sensed it shifting. She stepped back into the tent before he could see her. Kael had spent the 36 hours well. She had to give him that. Whatever she thought of the position she was in, and she tried, with limited success, not to think about it too directly, because the thinking led to a low, cold anger that wasn't useful yet. The man had not wasted the time he'd been given. 3 of his senior officers had taken her account in careful rotation, cross-referencing what she told each of them with what the others had recorded, building the kind of corroborated testimony that was difficult to dismiss as a single disgruntled account. A camp archivist had pulled every document in Kael's administrative records that bore the council seal from the relevant period. 2 riders had been dispatched south to a secondary pack territory with names Lyra had provided. Witnesses who might still be reachable, whose corroboration would convert her account from allegation to evidence. She had not slept more than 4 hours in 2 days. The children had adapted to the camp with a speed that she found privately both impressive and alarming. Sarah had attached herself to the camp's cartographer with a focused interest in the Northern Territorial maps that the cartographer found either charming or unsettling. Lyra couldn't determine which. Wren had identified the senior weapons trainer within the first hour and had spent most of the time since watching the training drills from a careful distance, not asking to participate, just watching with that deep measuring attention of his. Neither child had asked her again about the rider in the middle. They knew. She was fairly sure they'd known since the cave. She'd deal with that in some future where she had more than 36 hours between crises. Kael met Voss at the edge of the cleared space. Lyra watched through a gap in the tent canvas, positioned so the light was behind her. She had positioned herself this way deliberately, not hiding exactly, but not presenting herself until she understood how the first contact played. The greeting between the 2 men was the greeting of people who had a formal relationship with no warmth behind it. Voss dismounted and executed a correct bow. Not deep enough to be genuinely deferential, not shallow enough to be openly insulting. The calibration of a man who had spent years navigating exactly how much respect to perform without actually providing any. "My king," his voice carried across the cleared space, measured. "I came as soon as your scout's message reached me." "My scout's message," Kael said, "told you we were in the northern range. Nothing more." "Of course." A pause. "I heard there had been a discovery in the mountain settlements. Survivors from the earlier territorial period." Survivors. She absorbed the word and what it meant that he'd chosen it. Not residents, not inhabitants. Survivors. A word that acknowledged the exile without naming it, that positioned her existence as an outcome of a natural process rather than a deliberate act. "There was," Kael said. "I wanted to offer whatever context I could, given my familiarity with the Ashvane Council records from that period." "I appreciate that." Kael's voice gave nothing. "Come inside." Shut. She was seated at the map table when they entered. She watched Voss see her. Watched the moment of it. The controlled face, the practiced face. Running a calculation so fast it was almost invisible. Almost. She'd learned to read fast calculations in 6 years of watching her own face in still water and understanding what her expressions cost her. His cost him something too. She saw the price of it in the half-second before his face settled. "Lyra Ashvane," he said. "Voss." She didn't give him a title. She didn't stand. He looked at Kael. "You've already spoken with her." "Extensively," Kael said. Voss moved to the other side of the table with the ease of a man reorienting in a room he'd expected to control. He sat without being invited to. His eyes went around the tent, the documents laid out on the left side of the table, the 2 officers standing at the rear, the absence of the kind of preliminary social negotiation that formal meetings usually opened with. He understood that he was not in a preliminary conversation. "Whatever she's told you," he said, "I want the opportunity to provide the council's perspective." "You'll have it," Kael said, "after you tell me how a woman listed as deceased in council records is sitting across from you." The air in the tent changed quality. Voss looked at the documents on the table. She saw him locate the death record, his own signature at the bottom, and watched him make the decision about how to handle it. The decision took less than 2 seconds. That speed was, in its own way, more damning than anything else he did in the next hour, because it meant he'd already prepared for this possibility. He'd known, riding into this camp, that the death record was going to be on that table. "Administrative error," he said. "A death record is an administrative error," Kael said. "Exposure deaths in the northern range during that period were handled in bulk processing. It's possible, likely, given the volume, that her file was coded incorrectly based on the initial field report." He was looking at Kael, not at her. "I can pull the original field documentation and cross-reference." "I'd like that," Kael said. "I'd also like you to explain the exile order." Standard pack discipline within council authority under the administrative delegation. For an Omega with no recorded violations. The classification system. Contamination risk, Lyra said. Voss looked at her for the first time since sitting. That's the term you used, she said. In the council session. I wasn't present, but I had a source. Contamination risk. She held his gaze. You want to explain what that classification covers? It covers wolves who present with bloodline irregularities that pose a risk to pack genetic record integrity. He said it smoothly, the voice of a man reciting a policy he'd written himself. It's a standard. It covers wolves who make the council's lineage records look wrong, she said. That's what it covers. And the wolves classified that way were exiled, not registered and monitored and studied, which is what any legitimate genetic integrity protocol would do. They were removed. Their files were closed. She paused. Some of their files were closed with death records. I won't sit here and be accused of... Then stand, she said. The tent went very quiet. Voss looked at her. She watched something shift in him. Not the careful face, that was still in place, but something underneath it. A recalibration of what kind of problem she was. He had ridden into this camp expecting a frightened exile, possibly an angry one, almost certainly an isolated one whose account could be managed with a combination of technical language and the implicit weight of his position. He was sitting across from someone who had spent 6 years in a mountain preparing for this conversation and had just spent 36 hours making sure she didn't have to have it alone. My king, Voss said. He turned to Kyle. Whatever she's alleged, she's a former Omega exile with 6 years of grievance and no documentation. I have the full council records from that period, and I'm prepared to open them for review. Any review. I have nothing to hide from a proper process. Kyle looked at him for a moment. I know, Kale said. Something in the way he said it made the back of Lyra's neck prickle. I know you have the council records from that period, Kale continued, because I sent a request to the Ashvane archive 3 months ago for those records, as part of the Northern Integration Review. Standard process. He reached across the table and placed a single document in front of Voss. What arrived was a clean set of files covering the period. Complete. Well organized. Voss looked at the document. My archivist noticed, Kyle said, that the ink dates on roughly 40 of the files didn't match the paper aging. New ink on old paper, if you have the right tools to look. Approximately 40 files covering the exile period, reprocessed and resubmitted as originals. He paused. Someone knew I was looking. The silence in the tent was the kind that came before very large things shifted. I want to be clear, Kyle said, about what I'm telling you. This is not an allegation. This is a documented finding from my own archivist who has been in my service for 11 years and whose work I trust completely. 40 exile files with falsified origination dates. He looked at Voss with the expression of a man who had already completed the grief of this and moved into what came after it. Someone in the Ashvane Council architecture had access to those files recently enough to alter them, and you rode into my camp 36 hours after sending a writer to test my response. Voss said nothing. It was the nothing of a man deciding whether he was still in the negotiation phase or whether the negotiation had already ended without him. I didn't falsify anything, he said finally. Then help me understand who did. I can't... He stopped. Something crossed his face that was, for the first time, not entirely controlled. I can't speak to the archives process. That's handled by council staff. I don't have direct... Aldrich. Kale's voice dropped into something that wasn't loud and didn't need to be. I've known you for 12 years. I trusted your administrative judgment because you presented yourself as a man of process. I gave your council authority because I believed you were using it the way it was authorized to be used. A pause. I was wrong about that. I know I was wrong about that. What I'm asking you now is whether you're going to compound it. Voss looked at Kyle. Then he looked at Lyra. In his eyes, for just a moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent. The look of a man who had made a calculation a long time ago, had built a structure on top of that calculation, and had just understood that the structure was going to come down regardless of what he did next, and was experiencing the very specific variety of exhaustion that came with that understanding. You should know, he said, and his voice had changed timbre, quieter, more careful in a different way. That she's not what you think she is. Lyra went still. What I think she is, Kyle said, is someone your council exiled without cause. No. Voss looked at her. She's someone we exiled because we didn't have the authority to contain what she is, what she carries. He said the next words with the precision of a man releasing something he'd been holding a long time. The bloodline. The Ash Vein records didn't match because she doesn't belong in those records. She never did. Kale's attention sharpened. Explain that, he said. There are lineage records older than the pack system, older than the council structure, older than the current Alpha Kingdom framework. Records from the period before the consolidation, when the Northern Territories operated under a different authority entirely. Voss looked at her the way you looked at something you'd been afraid of for a long time and were now, past the point of any useful fear, simply observing. The bloodline she carries, the healing markers, the alpha profile presentation, the children's sight. Those markers appear in those old records. They're associated with a specific lineage, royal, pre-consolidation. A pause. We classified her as a contamination risk because we didn't know how to classify her as what she actually is. And what she actually is was something the Ash Vein Council, all of us, had been told no longer existed. The tent was absolutely silent. Lyra heard her own heartbeat. She heard Sarah, somewhere outside, speaking to the cartographer in her clear child's voice. She heard the camp moving around them. She heard all of it with a hyper-specificity that happened when the body understood something fundamental was being said before the mind had caught up. Say it plainly, Kyle said. Voss looked at her. She is the last heir of the Vailindra line, he said. The bloodline that governed the Northern Territories before the Alpha Kingdoms formed, before everything the current power structure is built on. He sat back. We exiled her because an Omega Vailindra heir who survived and reproduced would have a legitimate claim to territorial authority that supersedes the councils, supersedes the pack system, and in certain interpretations of the old accords. He paused, and she heard what was coming before he said it, heard it in the specific quality of the silence around those words, supersedes yours. Kael did not move. That's why you came, Lyra said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her, given what was happening inside her chest. Not to manage what I'd told him, to make sure he understood what I was before I understood it myself, to see if you could still control the framing. Voss looked at her. It doesn't matter anymore, she said. Not to him. To herself, mostly, working through it in real time. The archive falsifications, you weren't covering the exile. You were covering what triggered it. If anyone pulled those original files and saw what bloodline markers were actually recorded, they'd have the same question you just had to answer out loud. She stood up. The movement wasn't dramatic. She just needed to be on her feet for what came next. She felt it arriving the way she'd felt the army. In the bones first, the animal intelligence that had kept her alive for 6 years running about 3 seconds ahead of her conscious mind. She looked at Kael. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the controlled authority, not the recognition of the mate bond. Something more fundamental than both. The look of a man confronting the specific situation where the thing he was trying to protect and the thing he was trying to protect it from had just turned out to be parts of the same architecture. She understood it, in that moment, with a clarity that was almost gentle. He had come into these mountains looking for evidence of a council corruption that threatened the integrity of his kingdom. He had found her instead. He had understood her as an exile wronged, a mate found, a situation to be corrected. He had not understood that correcting it might mean dismantling the framework he'd spent 30 years building. She hadn't understood it either until 30 seconds ago. I need to be outside, she said. Neither man spoke. She walked out of the tent and into the cold air of the valley, and she stood in the gray afternoon light with the camp organized around her and the mountain at her back. And she did what she had done 6 years ago at the tree line. She went very quiet inside and let the size of it be what it was. The difference was that 6 years ago she'd had nowhere to go but north. Now she had children with a bloodline that superseded kings, and a king who had just found out that the woman he'd decided to protect might be the single most destabilizing force in his empire. And Aldrich Voss was still inside that tent, and she didn't know, standing there in the cold, whether the danger she was in now was greater or smaller than the danger she'd been in when they'd pressed iron to her mark and pointed her at the snow. She knew one thing. She was done letting other people make that calculation for her. She was still standing in the cold when Kyle came out. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his step, already distinguishable from every other step in the camp in a way she didn't examine too closely. He stopped beside her, not in front of her, not angled toward her. Beside. Two people looking at the same mountain. "He's in custody," Kyle said. "I know. I should have moved on him 3 months ago when the archive discrepancy surfaced. I wanted more before I acted." A pause. "That delay cost you 2 extra days of exposure." "It cost me considerably less than the original 6 years." He absorbed that without defense. The mountain was doing what mountains did in the late afternoon, pulling the shadows down from the peak in long gray sheets, the temperature dropping with a speed that only people who'd lived at altitude understood was coming before it arrived. She pulled her coat tighter. A borrowed coat, iron veil gray, because everything she owned was in a cabin that an army was camped around. "The Velindra line," she said. "Yes." "You knew about it before today." He didn't answer immediately. The pause was honest enough, not the pause of someone searching for a lie, but of someone deciding how much truth to give in a single measure. "I knew about the pre-consolidation lineages, the theoretical framework, the old accords that governed the northern territories before the Alpha Kingdom structure replaced them." He paused again. "I did not know anyone carrying that bloodline was still alive." "Would it have changed how you approached the integration campaigns?" He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the mountain. "Yes," he said. "How?" "I would have come looking sooner." She let that sit in the cold air between them. Coming looking sooner meant finding her when the twins were 4, 3, 2, when she was more fragile, when the mountain hadn't yet finished the work of making her into whatever she currently was. She wasn't sure sooner was better, regardless of his intentions, and she was honest enough with herself to hold that complexity without resolving it in either direction. "What happens now," she said, "with Voss in custody, is that his allies, and he has them, he didn't build that council structure alone. Hear about it. Fast." "Faster than we'd like," Kyle agreed. "You have maybe 48 hours before whoever he's been coordinating with decides how to respond." She turned to look at him now. "And responding means targeting the problem. You've arrested the man who managed the system. The system's other managers are going to look at what destabilized him and decide whether to eliminate the variable. You're the variable. My children are the variable." Her voice didn't shake. She made it not shake by remembering that she was done spending energy on shakiness. The Velindra bloodline in living heirs is what Voss was trying to prevent anyone from documenting. His arrest is going to be read as confirmation that the documentation exists. Hale was looking at her with the face of a man who is running the same calculation and arriving at the same answer. "I need to move you," he said. "I know." "Iron Veil, the main hold, it's the only—" "I know." She had known it since she walked out of the tent, since Voss had said the words and she'd watched Kyle's face absorb them. There was only one defensible position for what she was and what her children were, and that position was inside the Alpha King's own walls, like it or not, and she had spent the last 10 minutes making her peace with what that meant. "We leave tonight." She saw something move through his face. Not relief, something more controlled than relief. Acknowledgement. The specific quality of acknowledgement between two people who have arrived at the same conclusion by different routes and are only now realizing they were running parallel the whole time. "Tonight," he confirmed. She went to find her children. Acha. They were 3 hours north of the valley camp when the first signal flare went up behind them. Lyra saw it from the ridge trail, a hard red streak against the black sky, the kind of coordinated signal used for military communication at range. 1 flare meant message, 2 meant urgency. She counted. 3. 3 meant the camp was under attack. She stopped her horse. Beside her, Kyle had already pulled up, his head turned south, reading the sky with the expression of a man receiving information he'd hoped would wait longer. "They move faster than 48 hours, she said. "Much faster." He was already turning to the lead officer of their escort. 12 riders, the same number Voss had brought in, which she registered with a grim appreciation for irony. "Signal back. Defensive posture, protect the documents, do not pursue. My king, they're not after the camp, Kael said. The camp is a distraction. Signal back. The officer went. The flare went up. In the silence that followed, Lyra was counting the horses she could hear and the horses she couldn't. The ones in the tree cover on the eastern slope that had been pacing them for the last 20 minutes at a distance just beyond confident identification. You hear them, she said, for the last mile. His jaw was tight. 8, maybe 10. Cut us off at the pass or take us on the trail. Pass is tighter ground, easier to control with smaller numbers. He looked at the trail ahead, then at her. We're not going to make the pass before they do. The trees to the east shifted. No wind. Children, Lyra said, sharp and quiet. And Sarah and Wren moved their horses inward without any instruction beyond the word, closing the gap between themselves and her with the practiced smoothness of children who had run drills for exactly this. Then the riders came out of the trees. 10 of them. Not Iron Veil gray. The markings were unfamiliar at first. Dark leather, no visible pack insignia, the kind of deliberate anonymity that wasn't actually anonymous to anyone who knew that coordinated paramilitary operations required funding, training, and authorization. These were professional wolves. Someone had paid for them. They spread across the trail in a formation designed to prevent forward movement without closing into contact range. Patient, confident, the arrangement of people who believed they controlled the terms of what came next. The lead rider stopped 12 feet from Kael's horse. Step aside, Kael said. His voice had no heat in it. That was the thing about him she'd been watching for 36 hours. The way the temperature of his voice dropped when the situation became most serious, down and down until it was barely above quiet, and somehow that was more absolute than shouting. The woman and children come with us, the lead rider said. The rest of you turn back. No. The lead rider looked at Kael the way you looked at an obstacle you'd already decided to move. This isn't a negotiation. No, Kael said. It isn't. He moved first. Lyra had expected him to signal his officers, had expected the coordinated response of a trained escort engaging an intercept force, tactical, organized, the machinery of professional soldiers doing what they were built to do. What she hadn't expected was for the Alpha King to simply move horse and body in one sudden decision straight into the gap between the two lead riders, with a speed that functioned as its own kind of violence, because no one on that trail had predicted he'd do it personally. The escort erupted into motion behind him. The tree line to the west produced 4 more Iron Veil riders who'd been running parallel dark. She hadn't heard them, and the understanding that Kael had positioned advanced riders she hadn't detected shifted something in her assessment of him that she filed away for later examination. Go, Kael shouted at her. Not a request. The children go, she said, and pulled her horse sideways to put herself between the attackers and Sarah and Wren. She heard him make a sound behind her that was somewhere between fury and something she didn't have a word for, and then there was no more time for sound because 2 of the Dark Riders had broken from the main engagement and were coming at her specifically, and she understood with absolute cold clarity that these 2 had a single objective, and it wasn't her. It was behind her. She drove her horse directly at the closer rider. She was not a trained cavalry fighter. She was a woman who had learned to read bodies and landscapes and the physics of things moving toward her at speed, and she knew, from 6 years of catching things and tracking things and occasionally fighting things in the dark of a mountain winter, that the only way to stop a more skilled opponent was to take away their ability to use their skill by forcing them into a situation too close and too fast for technique to matter. She got very close and very fast. The collision wasn't clean. Her horse took a shoulder hit that knocked them sideways, and she grabbed leather and mane and stayed on by pure grip strength, her left arm screaming from the wrench of it. The rider she'd hit had lost his direction and was fighting to control his horse. The second rider had adjusted, was going wide, going around her, going for the children. She had just enough time to register that she wasn't going to reach him in time. And then something happened. Sarah screamed, not fear, not pain. The sound was the precise opposite of those things. A sound Lyra had never heard from her daughter, had never heard from any person. A sustained note that seemed to come from somewhere below the frequency of voice and above the frequency of instinct. The rider going for the children pulled his horse up hard, the animal gone suddenly wild-eyed and pitching, and the darkness around Sarah's position shifted in a way that Lyra's eyes could not fully account for. Not light, not shadow, but something that reorganized the space between her daughter and the rider in a way that made the rider's horse categorically refuse to move forward. The rider fought it. The horse won. Ren was beside his sister, one hand on her shoulder, his silver eyes doing that thing she'd spent 6 years not looking at too directly. The deep, running quality of something vast moving through a very small container. The engagement lasted another 4 minutes. Lyra knew because she counted, which was something she did in crisis situations to keep the part of her mind that was useful from being consumed by the part that was not. 4 minutes of controlled violence on a dark mountain trail, 12 escort riders and 4 advance riders against 10 intercept wolves who had skill and positioning and lost both advantages in the first 30 seconds to Kael's opening move. When it resolved fast, the way these things did. A single moment where the calculus shifted and the losing side knew it, and the ones who could run ran. 3 couldn't. The trail went quiet. Lyra got off her horse. Her left arm was singing from the shoulder down in a way that meant muscle damage rather than bone, which was manageable. She walked to where Sarah and Ren were still sitting their horses, steady, both of them, silver eyes bright in the darkness, and she put her right hand on Sarah's leg. "Are you hurt?" "No." Sarah's voice was smaller than it had been. The sound that had come out of her 30 seconds ago seemed to have cost something. There was a quality of depletion in her face, the look of a muscle used past its usual range. "Ren." "Not hurt," Ren said. "She did most of it." "I know." Lyra looked at her daughter. "We'll talk about it later." "I know," Sarah said. Kael reached them on foot, his horse trailing behind him. He had a cut along his left jaw that was bleeding with the unhurried persistence of a face wound, and he was moving without favoring anything, which meant his injuries were either minor or he'd locked them down entirely. He looked at the children first, then at Lyra. His eyes found her left arm. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to—" "You were going to offer to have a healer look at it. Yes. When we're somewhere they can't send a second wave at us." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "Can you ride?" "I can ride." They reached Iron Vale at dawn 3 days later. She saw it first as a shape against the morning sky. The walls older than she'd imagined, dark stone that had the particular quality of things built to last rather than to impress, though the scale was impressive enough without trying. The city inside the walls had woken early. She could hear it from half a mile out. She rode in next to Kael and did not let herself look at the walls too long, or the gates, or the faces of the soldiers who snapped to attention as the column passed through. She looked ahead. She kept her spine level. Beside her, Ren was looking at everything with the attention of a person cataloging. Sarah was looking at Kael with an expression Lyra had privately decided not to notice. The inner courtyard was organized around their arrival in the practiced way of a household that had been managing returns from campaigns for years. Stable hands, officers, what appeared to be a senior household staff, all of it moving with the precision of a large operation that didn't require supervision for the ordinary parts. Kael dismounted and turned to help her down before she'd registered he was going to. She took it. The arm was genuinely difficult, and the contact was brief and entirely practical, except for the 2 seconds of it where neither of them moved, and then they both did, and she was on the ground. "You'll want to see the rooms before anything else," he said. "I'll want to know where the exits are," she said. Something moved through his face. "I'll show you myself." Before he could move, a rider came through the inner gate at a speed that was not the speed of ordinary dispatch. The rider hit the ground running and went straight to Kael's senior officer, bypassed the household protocol entirely, which meant whatever the message was had been classified above household protocol before it left its origin point. Lyra watched the officer's face as he read, watched him turn to Kael, watched him try to find a way to say what he was about to say. "Eastern border," the officer said. "The coalition. The 3 pact territories that declined integration last spring. They moved at midnight." A pause that was not long enough to absorb what came after it. "They've taken the eastern garrison. Our people are held." Another pause. "They're sending terms." The courtyard had gone entirely silent. "What terms?" Kael said. The officer looked at Lyra, and in that look she understood the terms before the man spoke them, understood them with the cold, complete knowledge of someone who had spent 6 years being the thing that powerful people bargained with, the thing that got moved from one set of hands to another while the hands shook each other and called it diplomacy. The Vailindra Scare, the officer said, surrenders to the coalition's custody, unaccompanied. In exchange, the garrison is released and the eastern border remains stable. He didn't look away from her. They're calling it a lawful reclamation under the pre-consolidation accords. If the heir is living and present in Iron Vale, they're saying they have a legal standing to demand custody. The words landed in the courtyard and stayed there. Kael's hand, at his side, had closed into a fist. Lyra looked at the sky above Iron Vale's inner walls, gray and pale with early morning, the stone dark against it. The whole architecture of a kingdom organized around a center she had not chosen and had not been given time to choose. 300 men in that garrison. She looked at her children. Sarah was watching her with those silver eyes, not afraid. Sarah was almost never afraid, which was its own kind of thing to carry as a mother, but utterly still. Ren had his hand on his sister's arm. She looked at Kael. His face was the face of a man who had already decided what his answer to these terms was and was watching her to see if she had arrived at the same place or somewhere different. She had spent 6 years surviving alone by understanding that power was not what you held, but what you were willing to hold when everything else was gone. She had understood that on the tree line with a coat in the mud. She had re-understood it in 100 different mountain winters when the only reason she got up and built the fire again was the 2 small bodies depending on her heat. She understood something else now, standing in this courtyard, with 300 soldiers in enemy hands and a coalition that had been planning this since before she walked out of those mountains. They had not made this demand because they believed she would surrender. They had made it because they needed to know whether Kael would let her. The answer to that question told them whether Iron Vale was vulnerable, whether the Alpha King's decision-making had been compromised by something personal, whether the Empire had a soft point where it used to have none. She looked at Kael. "Don't answer them yet," she said. "Lyra, I'm not surrendering," she said. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying don't answer them yet. Don't give them the read." She held his eyes. "Give me 1 hour." 1 hour for what? She thought about Sarah's sound on the mountain trail, the darkness that had reorganized itself between her daughter and the rider. The thing running behind those silver eyes that she had spent 6 years carefully not naming because naming it would have required her to name everything else. The bloodline, the heritage, the weight of being the last heir of something old enough that the current world had been built on top of its ruins. She was done not naming it. 1 hour, she said again, and then we do this differently than they're expecting. Kael looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the courtyard held its breath. Then he turned to his officer. "Send no response. 1 hour." The officer went. The courtyard began to breathe again, but Lyra was already moving, her children behind her, and 1 hour counting down in her chest like a second heartbeat, toward the decision she should have made 6 years ago on a tree line in the snow, that the only way to stop being hunted was to make it categorically not worth the cost. She was about to make it very expensive. The hour she asked for, she spent in a room she hadn't chosen with 2 children she'd raised alone and a decision she'd been deferring for 6 years. The room was a small antechamber off the main corridor. Stone walls, a single window facing east, a table with a water basin, and nothing else. Functional. Not a prison, but close enough to one in the way that any room feels like a prison when the door between you and the world outside contains a war you didn't start. She sat on the floor, not the chair. The floor, with her back against the stone wall and her bad arm resting across her knee and her children in front of her, and she looked at them the way she hadn't let herself look at them since the cave, completely, without managing what she saw. Sarah, dark hair and olive skin and silver eyes that were watching her mother with the particular quality of a child who has understood for some time that her mother carries something heavy and has been waiting patiently for the moment when the carrying becomes visible. Ren, quieter in his body than his sister, built differently. The stillness that had always been his, that she had attributed over the years to temperament, and then to training, and then, in her most honest moments, to something she wasn't ready to name. She was ready now. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Sarah nodded. Ren was already still. You know what happened on the mountain trail. What you did. She looked at Sarah. And you know it wasn't the first time something like that has happened. The winter 2 years ago when the ice shelf went. The time Ren was sick and you sat with him, and by morning the fever was gone. She paused. I told myself I didn't know what it was. That was a lie I was telling myself because I wasn't ready for what knowing would cost us. Sarah said, We knew you weren't ready. Layra looked at her daughter. We talked about it, Ren said. Not apologetic. Informational. We figured we'd wait until you were. She absorbed this. The specific experience of discovering that the people you believed you were protecting had been quietly protecting you back, that the arrangement you'd built around the idea of their vulnerability had been, at some point she couldn't locate, inverted, was its own variety of disorientation, not unpleasant, just large. The bloodline, she said, what Voss described, the Vailindra line. She looked at both of them. You carry it too. What's in me is in you, but what's in you is more, different. She chose the next words carefully, not because she was afraid of them, but because they deserved to be said correctly the first time. You are not weapons. You are not leverage. You are not a claim or a symbol or an argument in someone else's political case. You are my children, and nothing that happens in this building or outside it changes that hierarchy. She let that land. But I can't protect you by pretending anymore. The people outside this room already know what you are. So we need to decide together how we're going to carry it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What are our options? She asked. Practical, direct. Her mother's child in every possible way. Layra almost smiled. I'm working on that. What she worked out in the remaining 40 minutes was not a plan so much as an understanding of what the coalition had actually miscalculated. They had built their demand on the assumption that the Vailindra bloodline was a negotiating asset, something to be held, controlled, leveraged against Iron Veil's political stability. They had built it on the same foundation that Voss had built his exile order on, the idea that the bloodline was a problem to be managed rather than a force to be reckoned with, that the woman carrying it had spent 6 years being managed, being survived, being reduced to whatever a mountain and necessity could make of her. They had not updated their information. She had. When the hour was done, she went to find Kael. Better. He was in the war room with 4 senior officers and a map of the eastern border that had been marked up with the kind of rapid annotation that meant decisions were being made before she'd arrived to be part of them. She walked in without knocking. The officers looked at her. Kael looked at her. And the officers, with the particular sensitivity of people who understood command dynamics, made small movements that incrementally increased the space around the two of them. The terms, she said. How were they delivered? Writer. Written. Who signed? Coalition seal. 3-pack alphas. Gorvin, Mast, Rael. She knew Gorvin by reputation. A territorial alpha from the Eastern Range, old enough to remember the pre-consolidation period, which meant old enough to have trained on the Vailindra history as something cautionary, rather than merely historical. He was the one who'd understood what was in those archives. He was the one who'd moved when Voss's arrest confirmed the heir was alive. He's not going to release the garrison regardless of what I do, she said. You know that. Kael's jaw moved. I know. The terms are a test. They want to know if you'll trade me. If you will, they have confirmation that Iron Veil's Alpha King has a liability in his decision-making. If you won't, they initiate the conflict they've been building toward for months, using the garrison as the trigger. She looked at the map. There's no version of these terms where the garrison comes home safe on the coalition's initiative. Which means we take them home ourselves, Kael said. Yes. She looked at him, but not the way they're expecting. She told him what she'd worked out in the antechamber. He listened. The officers listened. When she was done, the room held a silence that was not the silence of doubt, but of people absorbing the shape of something they hadn't considered. You'd be exposed, Kael said, if it doesn't work the way you think it will. I've been exposed before, she said. The difference is this time I'm choosing it. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that one of the officers shifted his weight. What do you need from me? Kael said. Your soldiers at the perimeter. Visible. I want Gorvin to see the force before I walk in. She paused. And I want your word that if something goes wrong, the children come out regardless of what happens to me. Nothing is going to... Your word. His eyes were on hers, and she held them, held the full weight of the look without flinching, because this was the center of it. This was the thing that mattered more than the bloodline and the coalition and the garrison and everything else that had happened in the past 4 days. This was where she found out what kind of man he was when the cost became personal. "You have it," he said, low and absolute. "My word." She nodded once. "Then let's go get your garrison back." Hita. The eastern meeting point was a flat ground 3 miles from the garrison hold, neutral territory by the coalition's own designation, which meant it was the ground Gorvin had chosen to be strong on. He arrived with 40 riders and the elaborate performance of an alpha who believed he controlled what was about to happen. Lyra arrived with 12 Iron Veil outriders, her children, and Kael. She felt Gorvin's red of the group from 50 feet away. The dismissal of the numbers, the confusion at the children's presence, the complicated calculation of what the Alpha King's physical attendance meant. He was a large man, old in the particular way of wolves who'd spent decades enforcing their dominance, the years written in scar tissue, and the set of his shoulders. He looked at her and understood immediately that she was what this was about. He did not look at the children. That was his error, and she'd counted on it. "The heir presents herself," he said. Formal. Ritual language from the old accords, precise enough that he'd clearly practiced it. "I present myself as myself," she said, "not as a legal position, not as a bargaining piece." She walked forward without waiting for permission, which took him slightly off his red. "You studied the old records, the Vailindra history, long enough to know what's standing in front of me. Then you know the bloodline doesn't transfer under coercion." She stopped 12 feet from him. "The pre-consolidation accords, the ones you're citing, include a provision you've apparently skipped. The Valindra authority cannot be held. It can only be given. The moment you attempt to contain it, the legal standing you're claiming dissolves." She tilted her head slightly. "You built this entire operation on a foundation that has a structural failure in it." Gorvin's face shifted. "You're bluffing," he said. "I'm quoting," she said. "Article 7 of the Northern Territorial Compact. Original text, pre-consolidation period. My archivist found it 3 hours ago." She watched his face. "Your archivist apparently didn't." The 40 riders behind Gorvin were doing what trained wolves did in uncertain situations, reading their alpha for signals, waiting for the command dynamic to resolve. She could feel it, the specific tension of a large group whose certainty was draining away through the behavior of the person they'd organized around. "Release the garrison," she said. "And we end this here, without what's coming next." "What's coming next?" Gorvin said, and his voice had hardened back into the register of a man who'd decided bluster was his remaining option. "Is that I have 300 of my people against your 12... 14, Ren said. The word came from behind her left shoulder, quiet and precisely timed. She did not turn. She heard Gorvin process it, heard the exact moment he looked at the boy who'd spoken and made contact with those silver eyes, and the way that contact changed the temperature of the air between them. Sarah made no sound. She didn't need to. What she did was simply present, in the way she had been present on the mountain trail. That deep, running quality, the darkness that reorganized space. Lyra watched it move across Gorvin's 40 riders like weather. Horses shifted. Men looked at their hands. The rider on Gorvin's left, a younger wolf who had probably been the most committed of all of them this morning, pulled his horse back 2 steps without appearing to decide to. Power, Lyra had learned in 6 years of having none, was not what you held. It was what other people felt in the space between them and you. It was the calculation they made about the cost of the next move. She had survived a mountain by making herself into something that made that calculation resolve consistently in a single direction. Her children had been born already knowing it. Gorvin looked at her. She looked back and said nothing, because nothing was exactly what the moment needed. He released the garrison before noon. The return to Iron Vale took the better part of 2 days. The garrison soldiers traveled with them, tired, some wounded, the particular collective exhaustion of people who'd spent time as leverage and were now working out how to carry the experience. Lyra rode in the middle of the column and let the movement and the distance do what distance did. She thought about the tree line. She thought about it in the specific way she'd been thinking about it for 6 years. Not as a wound exactly, but as a reference point. the place her internal compass had been calibrated from. The cold, the coat in the mud, the decision to walk north rather than anywhere else, which had not felt like a decision at the time, but had turned out to be the most important one she'd ever made. She had walked north and built a life out of nothing. She had raised 2 children who could reorganize space with their presence. She had carried a bloodline she hadn't known she had, and a bond she'd believed severed in 6 years of mountain winters. And she had done all of it without asking anyone for help, because asking had not been an option. She was tired, she realized. She was tired in the deep way. Not the 4 days without sleep way, but the way of a person who has been sustaining a level of vigilance for so long that the vigilance itself had become invisible, had become just the texture of existing, indistinguishable from breathing. She was tired, and she was not in the mountains anymore, and there was a man 3 horse lengths ahead of her who had given his word and kept it. She didn't make it into a larger thing than it was. She'd learned, in the mountains, not to make things larger than they were, because the cold had no patience for inflation, kept only what was true. What was true was that he had given his word and kept it, and that was one true thing, and she was willing to build from one true thing. She had built an entire life from less. They completed the mate bond on the 18th day. Not in ceremony, not with the court arranged and the formal protocols observed, though those things came later and were their own kind of necessary. The public architecture of a new order requiring its public moments. Before any of that, on the 18th day, in the early morning before the hold had fully woken, she went to where Kyle was standing at the window of the war room with a cup of something cooling in his hand and the eastern light making the stone walls look almost warm. She stood beside him, not in front, not angled toward, beside. They stood like that for a while. "I don't forgive easily," she said. "I know. I'm not sure I forgive yet. What was done?" She was looking at the courtyard below, the early movement of the hold beginning its day. "But I think I understand the difference between what was done to me and what you're doing now. And I think that difference is something I can work with." He was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," she said. "I'm giving it anyway." She turned to look at him, fully, the way she'd been working up to since the cave, since the cleared space, since every conversation in between. If we are going to be something real, it can't be built on what I owe you or what you owe me. It has to be built on what we choose, every day, separately and together. "Yes," he said, like it was simple. "It's not going to be simple," she said. "No." The corner of his mouth moved. "But I've spent 30 years building an empire. I can sustain complexity." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and took the cup from his hand and drank what was left in it, which was cold tea and slightly bitter, and handed it back. He looked at the empty cup. "That was mine," he said. "You weren't drinking it." He set the cup down. And when he turned back to her, the expression on his face was not the Alpha King's expression, not the controlled authority or the tactical assessment. It was the face of a man standing in early morning light who had spent a long time in a large and powerful silence and had just heard something move inside it. She let him close the distance, let it be his choice, the way it needed to be hers. When the bond completed, when the thing that had been pressing against the wall between them since the cleared space in the valley finally moved through it, it was not the violent reclamation she'd half feared based on what the bond cutting had felt like. It was quieter than that. The warmth of a coal that had never entirely gone cold, finding its way back to something that had been waiting for it without knowing it was waiting. She stood at the window of Iron Vale's war room and felt, for the first time in 6 years, warm. Bound. The formal proceedings took 3 weeks. Aldrich Voss stood before a restructured council and gave a full account that was, she suspected, both more truthful and more strategically curated than his initial disclosure in the tent. The 2 council members whose names she'd given were located, one on the southern coast, exactly where she'd been told, one in a smaller pack territory further east, who had apparently believed distance was sufficient cover. Both were returned to face the accounting. The garrison soldiers were compensated. The exile records were opened and reviewed. Not just hers, but all 40 of the files with the falsified origination dates, and then the files beyond those, because once you started pulling a thread in a corruption structure that had been running for years, the thread was longer than anyone wanted. There were 11 other cases. 11 other wolves exiled under false classification, under Kael's administrative seal, during the same period. 3 were still alive. Lyra spent a significant amount of time with those 3. She didn't talk about the mountain with them exactly. She talked around it. The specific, practical knowledge of survival, the things that had mattered and the things that had seemed like they'd matter but hadn't. She gave them what she could, which was not enough, which was never going to be enough, but was what she had. On the day the new territorial code was formally adopted, a restructured framework that closed the administrative delegation loophole, established independent oversight for pack council decisions affecting individual wolves, and codified Omega rights within the kingdom structure in language specific enough to be enforceable. She stood beside Kael in the Great Hall of Iron Vale and did not stand a step behind him. He had not asked her to. She looked out at the assembled court and thought about the mountain, about the snare with the kinked wire, about the 4 hours in the cave watching a man she didn't yet know move through his camp with the particular authority of someone who'd stopped performing it. About Sarah's charcoal smudge and Wren's careful bootlacing, and the 1,000 small ordinary details of a life that had been built in silence and isolation, and that had turned out, against all probability, to have been building towards something. Not this. Not the hall and the code and the formal architecture of an empire restructuring itself. She didn't believe in tidy causality, in the idea that suffering served a purpose proportional to its cost. The mountain had cost her things she was not going to recover, and she'd learned to carry that weight without asking it to mean more than it meant. But she was here, her children were here, and the world that her children were going to grow up in was measurably different from the world that had put their mother in the snow. That was enough. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Sarah stood at her left, silver eyes tracking the room with the cartographer's instinct she'd been refining for 3 weeks under professional supervision. Wren stood at her right, still and attentive, and already, she could see it, the shape of what he was going to be, developing the precise quality of presence that made rooms organize themselves differently. She looked at them, then at Kael, who was looking at her. "Ready?" he said. She thought about everything the word had ever cost her. The tree line, the cave, the cleared space in the valley where an army had organized itself around her arrival, the 18 mornings in Iron Vale where she'd woken up in a stone room with a window facing east and had to decide again that staying was the choice she was making. Readiness, she had learned, was not a state you arrived at. It was a decision you kept making. It was the fire you built every morning, not because you were sure it would hold, but because the alternative was cold. She had been building the fire for 6 years. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. The mountain was behind her now, not gone. It would never be entirely gone. It had shaped her in the bone-deep way that survival shaped you, and she carried it the way she carried the scar on her finger, as information rather than wound. But it was behind her. What was in front of her was complicated and imperfect and real, and she had chosen it with open eyes, and she was warm. That was the whole of it. That was everything. It was enough.